Well, I know it may not look like it now, but a few years back, I used to play soccer in college. And our second year of college, we had 11 men out for the soccer team. Does anybody know how many people you field on a soccer team? 11. 11. So I was in the best shape of my life, without a shadow of a doubt. We ran all the time. And we would compete with just about anybody for the first half. For the first half of a game, I was amazed at how well we kept up with some of the better teams that we were playing. But then something would happen in the second half. They would bring in people off of this thing that you call a bench. And we did not. And so the gas in our tank was running on E. And sometimes it happens in life that same way. Right, where we're cruising along and we're expecting reinforcements to come, but the cavalry never really arrives. The bench is a little thin. And maybe it's just volunteering. Like you've volunteered to man a concession booth from 2 to 4, and at 4 o'clock you're like, is anybody coming? 4:15, you're like, dude, guys, come on, I gotta go. Right, and it gets a little thin. And this has happened in church leadership too. I've served a couple different churches where I've heard this same kind of story where they say, you know what, hey, we looked behind us to try to figure out where the next group of leaders was at, but nobody was there. There's nobody to hand the baton off to. And one group of leaders in particular, I said, if they're not there, it's because we haven't done a very good job raising them. Right? It's our responsibility to train up the next group of leaders. Parents and grandparents, it's our responsibility to raise up the next generation. Right? We can't simply look back and go, well, where'd they go? Like, we get the opportunity to provide influence. They get to make the choice, but we can provide the influence. As a church, right, we can't look back and go, hey, where's the next group of leaders at? If we're not willing to pour into men and women who could be the next generation of leaders. I mean, that's one of the things I love about what we're doing here at Connection, to be able to see so many students in our youth ministry, not just serving on the youth Sunday, but serving every Sunday. Serving in our kids ministry, serving in worship, serving in the tech booth. When we're doing outreach events, they're right there serving with us. We have kids that are coming alongside of mom and dad, and they are learning the culture and the habits of life involved in the church and service, and it's great. And I always kind of wondered, like when I went from youth ministry to preaching ministry, would I still be able to have an influence in the lives of young people? And I think absolutely. Or absolutely. We had the opportunity to see young men and women grow up into Christ. And it's not just a service opportunity. You know, when we say, hey, we need some help in the kids ministry, with the youth ministry. No, these are opportunities to fan into flames gifts that God has given, to pass a torch in a profound way to the next generation and beyond. But the question always remains, did we do enough to equip the next generation to receive the torch that's going to be passed to them? We're going to hit that a little bit as we wrap up our study of Deuteronomy this morning. Before we get there, I want to share with us a little bit about where we've been on this journey so far. So this year we've been going through the Old Testament in a really mile-high overview of everything that's going on, because I want you to be able to see the story, the seamless story of God woven across generations, years, different leaders, different places. And when you get that high and you look at the story, you're going to notice a lot of parallels in the story. A lot of times the same story is just repeated to a different generation. The same story is repeated to a different place, a different king, a different people group. But the story is much the same. And I hope that you see that in the Old Testament. So we go back to Genesis, in the beginning. Right? Genesis means beginning. So in this series that we did last time, we were talking about how oftentimes, as men and women, we come up short. And the people in Genesis are no different than that. From the time that God created, let us create man in our image. He created everything and it was very good, but the humans were flawed. Right inside of us was a sin nature to try to do the things that we shouldn't be doing. And so Adam and Eve messed things up, but they weren't the only ones that messed things up. Right? It went from generation to generation. And as we walked through Genesis, we got to chapter 6, and now everything is corrupt, and people are making all sorts of dumb decisions, rebelling against God, so much so that He brings on a great flood. But He saves the most righteous man. And then after that, we realize that even the most righteous man had flaws. We get to Abraham and all of the stories of his faith. I mean, go to Hebrews chapter 11. You see all of these stories of faith and all these people who, well, they weren't very faithful all the time. And sometimes that's us, right? We are people of faith who we're not faithful all the time. It doesn't always measure up. We oftentimes fall short. But God is still orchestrating the whole thing. We get to see nuggets like in our image, right? That Jesus was there in the beginning, even though He's not mentioned by name. I love how in 1 John it kind of talks about that. In that beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Like Jesus was there in the beginning. And when Adam and Eve messed things up, right, there's this story of like the offspring is going to crush the head of the serpent. There's a promise. Right? And the promise for Abraham, even though you don't have any kids, you're going to have a lot of kids. And even though you don't have a land, you're going to have a land, but not you. Your descendants after you are going to have this promised land. In God's provision. When the people were facing a desperate time, they were led down to Egypt, and God provided for them. But they stayed too long. Right? Maybe not too long by God's standards, but another generation had passed. Joseph wasn't leading anymore. The same Pharaoh was not leading anymore. It's a new Pharaoh. And, well, the Israelites kind of scared him a little bit. He was afraid of getting dominated. And so he oppressed them in harsh slavery. But God rose up a deliverer in Moses to lead the people out. But Moses himself was flawed. Every step of the way, it's God's provision, God's timing, God's miraculous work, despite all of the fallen nature of the people. And in Reset, we've been talking about from Exodus and Deuteronomy, how this whole passage of like leading out of slavery and into that promise that God has extended so long ago. And you're going to see in the first part of Deuteronomy, which we hit last week, and this part of Deuteronomy meaning the second telling of the law or another telling of the law to another generation. It's quite redundant, right? Because they repeat what's important. It's an important thing to pass along when you're getting ready to enter into the promise. These things are critical. Make sure that you do them. And so I'm going to tell them, and then I'm going to tell them, and then I'm going to tell them so that they will know it and so that they will own it and be able to move in effectively. And so as we talk about this, I want to share with you some key tools, some key principles that we gain through these passages about passing the torch from one generation to the next generation. These same things, principles, can be applied in church leadership, in discipleship. They can be applied in your workplaces. They can be applied in your parenting style. Right? There are universal principles that we can take as we go from Moses to Joshua, the passing of the torch. So let's go to the first one, Deuteronomy chapter 27, verses 1 through 3, page 168 in the black Bibles we provide. Deuteronomy chapter 27. Now Moses and the elders of Israel commanded the people, saying, "Keep the whole commandment that I commanded you. And on the day that you cross over the Jordan to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall set up large stones and plaster them with plaster, and you shall write on them the words of the law." Right? When you cross over, you're going to make a huge monument. And you're going to write on that monument all the important things that you're supposed to know. We do this, right? We make a note tab, we make a sticky note, we write down all the important things we're supposed to remember. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure we've hit the high points. When we go to the grocery store, we want to make sure we got the things we need. How many times do we get home and we don't have the things that we need? We don't write them down. You just walk in there, you have one mission, one thing, and you walk out and you get everything but the one thing. And this is what happens so many times when we walk in. And so the command is this: when you walk in, I want you to write it down. Write it big so that you're not going to forget it. It's a great memory tool, by the way, to write things down. Sometimes it helps just to handwrite something down to get it stuck in your head. Write it down multiple times to reinforce that. Put it someplace where you can see it. Right? This is what they were going to do. Verse 11. And that day Moses charged the people, saying, when you have crossed over the Jordan, these shall stand on Mount Gerizim to bless the people. And there's a group of people mentioned. Verse 13, and these shall stand on Mount Ebal for the curse. Right, so now we get this great object lesson. There's two mountains. We got a group over here on this one and a group over here. Now, don't be thinking Rocky Mountains. This is not what's going on here. Right, but the people are gathered, and here are the two hills, and you've got a group of speakers on each one, and one of them's going, hey, if you do this, and these blessings will happen, and then you got the group over here going, but don't do this stuff, because bad stuff's going to happen. And so all the people are gathered together, and they're hearing the law repeated to them. Why? So they'll remember it, because it's super important. You see, the people that they're driving out haven't been following after God. They've been worshiping many false gods. And as much as they're coming into the promised land, for them, even more so, because it's an execution of punishment on the people who already live there. And so we need to remember to help the next generation remember what's important. What are we going to do to re-emphasize to the next generation what's really important? This doesn't happen without intentionality, right? That we say, hey, guys, whenever you're putting up your budget, this is the stuff you really need to work on because this stuff is important, right? When you're teaching your kids or your grandkids, these are the things you need to really focus in on because these are the things that are important, right? There's so many values, so many principles, so many leadership decisions, right? And there's a hefty amount that we place on ourselves here at Connection, and discipleship is part of this process. So we say around here, don't do ministry alone, right? Always take somebody with you, right? Teach them, encourage them, equip them to do the job. Because one day we're going to have to hang it up and somebody needs to be able to pick up the slack. Also, we do something we call the discipleship square, which is really nothing more than a mentoring tool, right? We do something and we invite somebody to watch. And the next time we invite them to help. And the next time they do it and we help them. And then the fourth time they do it and we watch. Right? Every step of the way we're discussing what this looks like so that we can pass the torch gradually to the next generation. But we have to pass the things that are important on to the next generation. So what are those things for us? For them, it was, hey, here are the laws and the commands. Right? If you do this, you'll be blessed. If you do this, you'll be cursed. You probably should pick the one with blessings. It's probably going to come to you a lot better. And so we read on to chapter 27. Chapter 28. We help them remember to obey, remember to teach, and then we present the consequences. At some point in my lifestyle, as a parent, I went into this mode of I need to teach my kids this is right, and this is wrong, and these are the consequences for right, and these are the consequences for wrong, and this isn't really my decision. You get to choose whether or not to receive my blessings or my curses, because sometimes it's going to come from mom and dad. Sometimes life is going to happen, right? If you do this, these consequences are going to happen. Bank on it. God built them into the system. And if you do this, this is what's going to happen. There's a natural cause and effect going on. But we need to present to the next generation the consequences. Right? There's the blessings, here's the curses. You don't believe me? Well, you're going to learn. You'll deal with them. Some of us are kind of thick-headed. We like to deal with the consequences our own way, you know. We like to make our own mistakes about how we do things. And it's frustrating as a parent, as a grandparent, to see our kids and grandkids make those decisions. And we're like, dude, if you'd have just listened to me. And you're like, how many times did I repeat these things? Because they're important. How many times did I write these things down? How many times did I send you to classes so that you'd get this information? And yet here we are. You're making those mistakes. But we present the consequences, and they did this in chapter 28. And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, being careful to do all of His commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above the nations of the earth. It goes on to say, like, He's going to bless the fruit of your womb, your children. He's going to bless your livestock. He's going to bless your food. He's going to defeat your enemies before you. In verse 9, He says, the Lord will establish you as a people holy to Himself, as He has sworn to you, if you keep the commandments of the Lord your God and walk in His ways. Right? There's a salvation that comes to us. There's a deliverance from sin and oppression, from the slavery, the yoke of sin that we deal with in our life. But there's also an expectation that we continue to live and walk as freed people, that we walk in obedience. That was true for them. It's true for us as well. If you faithfully obey, and then verse 15, But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all of His commandments and His statutes that I command you today, then all of these curses will come upon you and overtake you. Now, before I launch into this, I just want to say, if you came for a word of encouragement today, it's not probably found in chapter 28. Chapter 28 lays down the law. Like, if you do these things, this will happen to you. And it's not good. And I want us to earmark that. If you're reading along with us on this chronological journey through the Old Testament, read through chapters 26 through 34 and get a good picture of what's taking place here. The laws happen between the first part and the second part of Deuteronomy. Also in Leviticus, we get a glimpse into some of those laws that are there to protect the people, that are to set them apart as being holy to the Lord. But the consequences come here. And these consequences are many. It says that the birds will feed on your flesh. Sounds delightful. You will get the boils that the people in Egypt had. You'll get the blindness that the people in Egypt had. You will not prosper, it says in verse 29. Verse 30 says, you will betroth the wife and somebody else will ravage her. Please, sign me up. Right? This is not stuff that we want to see happen. Verse 48, therefore you shall serve your enemies, whom the Lord will send against you, in hunger and thirst and nakedness and lacking everything. Really? So if I don't obey you, then other people are going to come in and take my stuff, and they're going to misuse it right in front of me, and I'm just going to continue to lose at everything. You see, there's a difference in stepping into the blessings of God and stepping into the curses. Guys, so many times we see this ripple effect in our culture today. I see continually as a pastor somebody who's always got something negative going on in their life, and a lot of times, not always, because bad things happen to everybody, right? But a lot of times it's because we're not living in submission to the will and the Word of God. But when we trust Him, when we obey His commands, when we follow His Lordship, when we really trust Him, it's amazing the blessings that God lays out in our life, and we don't even see them. I was telling somebody else this last week. It's really hard to see when bad things don't happen. It's really hard to see all of the blessings that God pours out in front of us when we follow Him. But somewhere on the back end, we kind of deal with the consequences, good or bad. And so we dive into this a little bit more. It goes on to say in 52, they shall besiege you in all your towns until your high and fortified walls in which you trusted come down throughout all of your land. They would have seen this. Some of them firsthand, some of them secondhand. They were led out of Egypt. Forced slavery. Bad news. The plagues came upon one after another. 10 plagues in all. Before Moses was able to lead the people out of Egypt. God led them day by day across horrible situations through the Red Sea. Gave them bread and water and meat. And every single time it had nothing to do with what they did and everything about how God blessed them. every step of the way, it was how God blessed them. Everything that you and I have is because God has chosen to bless us with those things. It's not because we were good enough, because we all fall short. Right? So here's our chance to reset and do things the way that God would want them to be. But I think the challenge is this. You and I, we can see the big things that God does. We can have some amazing spiritual encounters where we go, man, God was moving in that moment. And then we walk out and we begin to build our own kingdom. Right? It's like, what can I accomplish? What can I do? What choices can I make? How can I make my family work the way it's supposed to work? How can I get a job, get the success, get the monetary gain that I need to have so that things are taken care of? And then we build for ourselves our kingdom. If they don't know now, they should know next week when they march into Jericho with its fortified walls. And by nothing of their own merit, these walls come crumbling down. So think about it. What are some of the things that we put our trust in, we put our hope in, that we continue block by block, brick by brick? We're building these walls, these monuments to our own account, our own will. Because when we're not living in obedience to God, those come crashing down. Verse 53, and you shall eat the fruit of your womb. Right? The first part of this, like, I'm going to bless the fruit of your womb. I'm going to bless your babies, your generations. But if you're not following after me, it's going to get so desperate that you're actually going to eat your family members. This is bad. Right? But these are all things that you and I, we log into the back of our minds so that whenever we see in the future the Israelites not being faithful to God and how desperate things were, we go, oh, well, guess what? God told them, here's the blessings, here's the curses, here's the consequences. Pick your poison. Which one you want? He even told them. Even the most tender and refined woman. Verse 56. And verse 60. And he will bring upon you again all the diseases of Egypt, of which you were afraid, and they shall cling to you. Every sickness and every affliction that was not recorded in the book of law, the Lord will bring upon you until you are destroyed. It says in verse 64, the Lord will scatter them amongst the people from one end of the earth to the other, if they don't live in obedience to Him, if they choose to worship other gods. So how do we present this when we pass the torch? Well, we set up altars for people to remember. We teach what's important and we present the consequences of what's taken place. But we also understand that God will make an example of people who don't do things the right way. And this is something we see in chapter 29. Verse 5, I have led you for 40 years in the wilderness. Your clothes have not worn out, your sandals have not worn off your feet. For 40 years, you didn't need to go school shopping. You didn't need that next outfit for the next thing. 40 years. It just lasted. You faced enemies, and guess what? You defeated them. Therefore, keep the words, it says in verse 9, of this covenant and do them, that you may prosper in all that you do. But here's the danger that comes in verse 18. Beware, lest there be among you a man or a woman or a clan or a tribe whose heart is turning away today from the Lord our God to go and serve the gods of those nations. Beware lest there be anyone among you, a root bearing poisonous and bitter fruit, one who, when he hears the words of the sworn covenant, blesses himself in his heart. He blesses himself, right? I'm going to build the walls. I'm going to build my kingdom. I'm going to tell God what to do and what not to do. And I'm going to be the one that extends my blessings, not God. When he is saying, I shall be safe, though I walk in the stubbornness of my heart, this will lead to the sweeping away of moist and dry alike. Right? There's going to be punishment, consequences that come as a result of when we get so full of ourselves. Right? And the way that I hear this and the way that I teach this oftentimes is whenever we say, hey, God and I have an understanding. No, God and you don't have an understanding. God has an understanding. Do we understand it? Right? God has a way that He wants us to do. He is able to see things that we don't see. And He's setting out these laws so that you and I can walk in a good place. Not because He's trying to be hostile towards us. He's trying to prevent the negative consequences from happening. But sometimes we think we know better than God. And we do things our own way. And I think that describes this as a stubbornness of the heart. We probably don't have any stubborn people here today, do we? Sometimes we can be kind of thick. We don't quite get it. So there's a warning. Verse 23, the whole land burned out with brimstone and salt, nothing sown and nothing growing, where no plant can sprout, an overthrow like that of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zobium, which the Lord overthrew in His anger and wrath. Right? There were destruction situations that happened in the past. Sometimes you and I, we get a model set before us in the generation ahead. And it tells us like, hey, mom and dad, this manager, this leader before me, man, they were faithful and good things happened. And so I need to try to repeat what they did. And sometimes we see what not to do. I feel like I've often been led by what not to do, which leads me to making my own set of mistakes and trying to figure out what the right thing is. Some of you probably have experienced this before. Right? You tend to repeat what the generation ahead of you did, or you kind of rebel against that. So we have an opportunity to step in and to see what's going on here. And as we do so, the examples of the fallen soldiers ahead serve as a really good example to like what not to do. This is actually what it says in verse 24. All the nations will say, why has the Lord done thus to this land? What caused the heat of this great anger? Then the people will say, it is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord. Right? Sometimes the body lie in ruin to serve as a monument, because when we set up the wrong monument of what to do and what not to do, then oftentimes the tombstones become the monuments by which we're supposed to learn from. And I hope we don't pass that kind of an example along. Chapter 30. We need to see that God has a way of restoring those who are repentant. And because we want to be like Christ, we also need to restore those who are repentant. Repentance is a huge piece here. Repent and be baptized, every one of you. Like, turn from your wicked ways and step into the truth. You need to step into the fullness of God. It says in chapter 30, verse 1, and when all these things came upon you, the blessings and the curse which I have set before you, and you call to mind all among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God. Right? You see all the stuff that I've been telling you about. When you see it, you're going to come back. And when you come back with a right heart. Return to the Lord. Obey His voice and all the commands, and He will restore your fortunes. Right? But we have to come in with all of our heart. So when somebody comes to you and they have a repentant heart and they're ready to lean in, then be quick to restore them to where they need to go. Because God has restored us. And then give options. Chapter 30 goes on to talk about, hey, I've set before you two choices. Right? There's the blessings and the curses. There's the life and there's the death. But it's your choice. Guys, I want to tell you this, that there is no preacher who can preach you into heaven. There is no priest that can forgive you into heaven. Mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, as hard as they want, are not going to get you there. The choice is going to be yours. Right? Adults, the choice is ours. Which one do we want? Which one are we going to pursue after? When we come time to pass the torch, the choice isn't going to be ours. You can want your kids to be saved, but you can't save them. You can want your grandkids to step into truth, but you can't make them. Right? The choice is ultimately going to be theirs, so we give them the options. We define the consequences. We try our best not to leave tombstones to be their mile markers. But we call them into repentance, into a new life, and that's their choice. I think this has helped me a lot as a pastor. As a pastor, I have to realize I can love people and I can preach truth. I cannot save anybody. Right? I can present the options, define the consequences. I can't save anyone. I have to realize with my own children, I can't make the choices for them. And so every one of us comes to these moments where we have to make a choice. See, I set before you life and death, good and evil, blessings and curses. Today you must choose whom you serve. So we give them options. And here are some final thoughts from chapter 31. And there's a few of them. One is that we need to be able to commission our successor. You'll notice in verse 6, Moses pulls Joshua aside and he says, hey, you need to be strong and courageous. You are going to lead this people in my absence. And then in verse 7 and following, he brings Joshua out before all the Israelites and he says, hey, this is your successor. This is the leader right here. Be strong and courageous. Follow this man. Right? So he commends him in private, but he recommends him in public. And then he reminds them what's important. Verses 9 through 13. Read every 7 years, get out there and read the message all over again. Remind them what they're supposed to do and not do. Because they're going to forget. So you need to be faithful with that. Tell them what's important. In verse 16. And the Lord said to Moses, behold, you are about to lie down with your fathers. You're about to die. Your time is about up. Then this people will rise. I don't know if you're following with the ESV. The ESV sometimes has got some very blunt terms in it. And they will whore after the foreign gods among them. They are entering into this land and they will forsake God and they will break His covenant that He's made with them. And His anger is going to be kindled against them. I don't know if you are like me, but I would be, if I was in Moses' shoes, I've lived a great life. It goes on to say in chapter 34, like how long he lived. He lived a great life and he led the people and he did miraculous things. And at this point, he's about to die and God says to him, hey, guess what? When you die, people are going to rebel. What the crap, God? What the crap? Like I just gave my entire life to lead this group of people. And the moment I don't show up for work, it all goes downhill. You see, if I were God, and I'm not, there would be a whole lot more floods. Because I'd get kind of fed up. How about you? Would you get fed up with you? I think we probably would. You see, we can lead. We can lead well. And we can prepare well. But it's still up to the next generation to execute. Guys, we can teach and we can preach and we can do youth ministry and kids ministry, but it's up to the next generation to pick up the torch. We can't do that. So I've got 3 key questions that are important for us today. The first one is, what choice will you make? The 2 choices are before you. Blessings and curses. Right? Life and death. To follow or not to follow. It's your choice. No one else can make that for you. Second question is this. What kind of torch are you passing? Right? Is it one of faithfulness? Or is it one of faithlessness? Is it one of God's kingdom or one of your kingdom? What are you promoting? I think we're supposed to let the light of Christ shine through us. And we need to do that well. What kind of torch are we passing? And number 3, to whom are you passing that torch? Right? It requires intentionality. The Great Commission, right? To preach and teach the good news. To teach them to obey. Who are we teaching to obey? What are you doing? If you are a parent or a grandparent, there is with no doubt in my mind you are teaching what you're teaching is the question. Right? But in your workplaces, are you being intentional with the opportunities you've got in your community? My hope is that the next generation, man, they see monuments and not tombstones that define us.